The 8,410th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Less than a month ago, when I last briefed the Security Council on the situation in Ukraine, I brought to the Council's attention the reports of increased tensions in the Sea of Azov and underlined the need to avoid any risk of escalation, provocation, or miscalculation. Regrettably, a serious security incident took place near Crimea, close to the Sea of Azov, only yesterday. I wish to underline that the United Nations currently cannot independently verify the circumstances surrounding the incident. However, reports indicate on 25 November an incident involving 3 Ukrainian vessels and at least 1 Russian vessel took place near the Kerch Strait when the former attempted to enter the Sea of Azov. A number of Ukrainian sailors, though the exact number remains unclear, were reportedly injured in the event. Ukraine claims that it had previously notified the Russian Federation of its intent to sail these vessels to the Ukrainian port of Mariupol in the Sea of Azov, which requires entry through the narrow Kerch Strait. The Russian Federation, meanwhile, claims that Ukraine has provoked the incident and that Russia acted in accordance with international law. According to media reports, the Ukrainian ships and their personnel are currently being held by the Russian authorities. Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council has since recommended the declaration of martial law. We understand that the decision remains subject to ratification by the Verkhovna Rada, which is meeting today. Mr. President, the waters of the Sea of Azov were claimed as being historically internal waters of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation, where vessels of the two countries have enjoyed freedom of navigation. However, tensions have risen in and around these waters since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which has been the subject of December 2016, arbitral proceedings under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea were instituted by Ukraine against the Russian Federation with regard to a, and I quote, dispute concerning coastal states' rights in the Black Sea, Sea of Azov, and Kerch Strait, end quote. The Russian Federation argues that the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait are not subject to the UNCLOS Arbitral Tribunal. Mr. President, the United Nations is deeply concerned about this escalation of tensions, which is taking place in the broader context of the conflict in eastern Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. In our last briefing to the Council, we urged all parties to avoid any unilateral steps that could deepen the divide or depart from the spirit and letter of the Minsk agreements. In that context, I wish to reiterate that the UN fully supports the lead role of the Normandy 4, the Trilateral Contact Group, the OSCE, and other key actors to find a peaceful settlement. I also wish to reiterate our call for renewed and constructive action by all concerned to overcome the apparent impasse in diplomatic negotiations. The UN underlines the need to fully respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders in accordance with relevant General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. Regrettably, yesterday's incident only threatens to cause the situation in and around Ukraine to deteriorate further. We strongly urge both the Russian Federation and Ukraine to refrain from any ratcheting up of actions or rhetoric and remind both of the need to contain this incident so as to prevent a serious escalation that may have unforeseen consequences. At this juncture, the immediate de-escalation of tensions in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea is required. It is critical that earnest attempts are made to find a peaceful settlement to the situation based on the diplomatic and legal means available and in accordance with the UN Charter. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. This morning, I spoke with President Trump and Secretary Pompeo, and my statement reflects the concerns at the highest level of the American government. For the past 4 years, the international community has spoken with a strong, clear, and largely united voice denouncing Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The United States, the European Union, and its member states, and many other countries have imposed sanctions against Russia for its unacceptable conduct in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Sunday's outrageous violation of sovereign Ukrainian territory is part of a pattern of Russian behavior that includes the purported annexation of Crimea and abuses against countless Ukrainians in Crimea, as well as stoking conflict that has taken the lives of more than 10,000 people in eastern Ukraine. And it shows no sign of decreasing. What we witnessed this weekend is yet another reckless Russian escalation. Let's be clear about what is known. Ukrainian ships set sail from one Ukrainian port to another Ukrainian port. They attempted to do so by the only possible way to go, through the Kerch Strait. Both Russia and Ukraine used the strait routinely. But this time, Russia decided to prevent passage of the Ukrainian ships, rammed them, and then opened fire on them. This is no way for a law-abiding, civilized nation to act. Impeding Ukraine's lawful transit through the Kerch Strait is a violation under international law. It is an arrogant act that the international community must condemn and will never accept. In May, the United States condemned Russia's construction and opening of the Kerch Strait Bridge between Russia and occupied Crimea. In August, the United States condemned Russia's harassment of international shipping in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. The United States will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine against the Russian aggression. It is our expectation that our European partners will lead this effort through the Normandy 4 format, which we support. We call on Russia to respect its international obligations and not obstruct or harass Ukraine's transit in the Kerch Strait, and to de-escalate the tensions it has created. As President Trump said many times, the United States would welcome a normal relationship with Russia. But outlaw actions like this one continue to make that impossible. The United States will maintain its Crimea-related sanctions against Russia. Further Russian escalation of this kind will only make matters worse. It will further undermine Russia's standing in the world. It will further sour Russia's relations with the U.S. and many other countries. It will further increase tensions with Ukraine. In the name of international peace and security, Russia must immediately cease its unlawful conduct and respect the navigational rights and freedoms of all states. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the U.S. for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the U.K.
Thank you, Mr. President. And may I just start by saying that I was disappointed by the Russian representative's explanation of vote in the previous round. As he himself stated, he did not actually make an explanation of vote, but a substantive statement. And in so doing, Russia showed contempt for the Security Council and its members by not accepting a procedural vote by this Council. Russia has regularly discussed Ukraine here under a different agenda item. In this instant, Russia deliberately chose a provocative title for the meeting, which they knew they would lose. I asked myself why, and I assume that Russia knows how weak its position of substance is, and so hoped to turn attention on process and play victim. Well, it will not work, Mr. President, because yesterday, by Moscow's own admission, Russian vessels opened fire on and seized 3 Ukrainian vessels approaching the Sea of Azov. We are deeply concerned about the 6 injured Ukrainians and 23 Ukrainians who have been detained by the Russian Federation, and we call for their immediate release. Mr. President, we condemn Russia's deplorable use of military force. This further demonstrates Russia's ongoing contempt for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and its contempt for the global rules-based international system which this organization serves to uphold. It follows on from Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its construction of Kerch Bridge in May this year, which constitutes a further violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Yesterday's action follows months of Russian harassment of international shipping in the Sea of Azov, presumably aimed at destabilizing the Ukrainian economy. Russia's actions are not in conformity with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the 2003 Russia-Ukraine bilateral agreement, which provides for freedom of passage for each state's vessels in the Sea of Azov, including military ships. Russia's actions must stop immediately. International shipping must be allowed free passage in the Sea of Azov. All parties must exercise restraint. Mr. President, we have seen this game before. Russia wants to consolidate its illegal annexation of Crimea and annex the Sea of Azov. Russia seems to hope that the international community will simply acquiesce and accept this as a new reality. Well, we will not. The United Kingdom's position is clear. We do not and will not recognize the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia. The General Assembly made its position clear in its resolution of the 27th of March 2014, and we continue to fully support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and territorial waters. This is why on the 31st of July, the European Union sanctioned 6 new entities in connection with Russia opening the Kerch Bridge. We continue to work closely with international partners to ensure that sanctions remain in place as long as Russia's control of the peninsula continues. Russia's illegal annexation constitutes a deliberate violation of a number of international agreements and commitments, including Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, the Budapest Memorandum, and the 1997 Russia-Ukraine Treaty of Friendship. But this is just the start. Russia's actions are also causing human suffering. Appalling human rights abuses in the Crimean Peninsula continue, with the widespread persecution of minority groups such as the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Tatars face regular harassment and risk arrest, detentions, and threats to seize their property. They have had their rights of worship, assembly, and expression restricted. The Crimean Tatars are not the only people suffering at the hands of Russia. Anyone who expresses even mild discontent or voices their opposition to this illegal annexation risks being charged with extremism and given a lengthy prison sentence, forcing many into exile. Russia continues to ignore calls by the General Assembly for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit Crimea. Mr. President, we remain clear in our support of the rules-based international system, which Russia continues to flout. Russia must not be allowed to rewrite history by establishing new realities on the ground. But this is sadly not the first time Russia has indulged in such reckless and provocative acts this year. Russia was responsible for a chemical weapons attack on British soil, and its agents were caught red-handed in The Hague. Russia has steadily increased tension in the Sea of Azov, and has now, by its own admission, fired on Ukrainian ships, injuring sailors on board. These are not the actions of a responsible country dedicated to the maintenance of international peace and security and to upholding the United Nations Charter. As my Prime Minister recently made clear, like others here today, we remain open to a different relationship with Russia, one where Russia desists from these attacks that undermine international treaties and international security, and desists from actions which undermine the territorial integrity of its neighbours, and instead acts together with the international community to fulfil the common responsibilities we share as permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. And we hope that the Russian state chooses to take this path. However, Russia's actions over the weekend do not give much ground for hope. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the UK for his statement. Now give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, given the commitment of the French and German authorities to resolve the crisis in Ukraine as part of the Normandy format, this statement is made on behalf of France and Germany. Mr. President, the maritime incidents yesterday are serious and are a source of serious concern to us. As we've just heard, the Kerch Strait, the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov yesterday were the theatre of violent manoeuvres that significantly increased tensions and the risk of escalation of violence. Once again, this underscores the instability of this region. The Russian forces declared that they had rammed and then seized, by using force, 3 Ukrainian warships which were seeking to cross this maritime area. 6 Ukrainian sailors were injured. Nothing, in our opinion, justifies this use of force. As our authorities stated this morning, as well as the permanent European members of this Council on Mission in Beijing, we'd like to express our serious concern regarding the actions of the last 24 hours. We urge the parties to great restraint. France and Germany calls on Russia in particular to respect and restore freedom of passage in line with the international law of the sea in the Kerch Strait, as well as access to the Sea of Azov, which is currently temporarily blocked. And we would urge for action to be taken to de-escalate the tensions immediately. We would also urge Russia to release as soon as possible those Ukrainian sailors who were detained and to restore the seized vessels. I would like to assure Ukraine of our solidarity and firmly reaffirm France and Germany's commitment for the full sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in its internationally recognized borders. The incident yesterday are the direct consequence of Crimea's annexation in March 2014 by Russia in violation of international law. We condemned the construction of the Kerch bridge by Russia. This contributes to deprive Ukraine of full access to its maritime areas in the Sea of Azov. Sir, the serious accidents of yesterday also underscore the need to find a lasting solution to the situation in the entire east of Ukraine. France and Germany will continue to rally, as they have done for some 4 years now, to de-escalate the situation in the east of Ukraine and to promote a long-term solution to the crisis through the Normandy format. Let us be clear. All parties, in particular Russia, must respect the commitments that they themselves have taken. The full implementation of the Minsk agreements that both Russia and Ukraine have committed to remain the only way to find a peaceful and lasting solution to this conflict, which has lasted for some 5 years now. Mr. President, France and Germany will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainian people, so long suffering in the recent years of conflict in Donbass and the illegal annexation of Crimea. You can be assured that we will continue our efforts along these lines in the Normandy format and in all the appropriate bodies. Thank you very much.
Thank the representative of France for the statement. Now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me echo the UK delegation by stressing that it is our understanding that the delivery by the Russian delegation of a de facto full substantial statement, once its request was rejected, did run against both the procedure and the practice of this Council. Mr. President, we have gathered today to discuss an additional demonstration of disregard for international law and undermining efforts to achieve peace in Eastern Europe. Russia has just added another dimension to the conflict in Ukraine. During the last Security Council briefing on Ukraine, we expressed our concern about the development of military capabilities that takes place in the Crimea and the Sea of Azov. For several months, Russia has delayed hundreds of commercial vessels attempting to reach Ukrainian ports in the Sea of Azov via the Kerch Strait for extended periods and at great economic cost for Ukraine. Now, Russia attacks Ukrainian vessels, stating the need for protection of, quote, Russian territory, unquote. Further militarization and increase of tensions brings more instability to a region that suffered enough. Mr. President, after the aggression against Georgia, the illegal occupation of Crimea, fueling the conflict in the Donbass, building the Kerch Bridge without the consent of the authorities in Kiev, farcical elections in the separatist regions in November 2011, Russia violated Ukraine's navigation rights. We strongly condemn Russia's aggressive actions. We call on its authorities to respect international law and to both sides to exercise restraint in the current situation, which may further jeopardize the stability of European security. This state-to-state conflict, initiated and fueled by Russia, has one aim: to destabilize Ukraine. Therefore, we urge the whole UN system to give a proper attention to this active armed conflict. We cannot turn a blind eye to this situation only because one of the permanent members of the Security Council is a side in this conflict. Russia's military actions in the Crimea and the Sea of Azov should serve as lessons learned on what this state is able to do in order to safeguard its critical infrastructure in Europe. Persistent violations of international law, including bilateral agreements, lead directly to imposing forced solutions aimed at controlling Russia's interests concerning the existing, being built, and planned communication and energy infrastructure. Mr. President, let me reiterate that Poland strongly supports the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We do not recognize Russia's annexation of Crimea. We do underline the need for the full implementation of the Minsk agreements, the only way to a lasting solution to the conflict in and around Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement. Now give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sweden is deeply concerned about the escalation in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. Blocking maritime traffic to and from Ukrainian ports using military force is a serious violation of international law. This violation comes against the backdrop of the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol in 2014 and the finalization of the bridge across the Kerch Strait earlier this year, both blatant violations of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We fully support the Ukrainian request for a council meeting in light of the latest developments. Any other country would have done the same and would have expected the issue to be handled as the threat to international peace and security that it constitutes. Russia's unwarranted and disproportionate checks of ships passing through the strait has been ongoing for months already. We regret that Russia has ignored the calls from Ukraine and the international community to abide by international law and allow free passage through the Kerch Strait, and instead has opted to escalate the situation further. In a situation which is already tense, this behavior is deeply irresponsible. As a first step, the naval vessels and crew members which have been detained should be immediately and unconditionally released. This would be an important step towards de-escalation. We urge Russia to act in accordance with international law. Let me underline, there can be no doubt that Russia has international legal obligations to refrain from blocking the access to Ukrainian ports in the Azov Sea and elsewhere, as well as to respect OSCE principles and commitments. We call on Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and its navigational rights. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Sweden for his statement. Now give the floor to the representative of Côte d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation welcomes the convening of this Security Council emergency meeting, given the serious nature of the incidents that took place yesterday on Sunday, the 25th of November, 2018, between the Russian and Ukrainian naval forces in the Kerch Strait. We would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, for her briefing. This region is already sorely tested by a conflict which, according to observers, has killed about 10,000 people since it started in 2014. Therefore, this upsurge in tension could further heighten the risk of a new military confrontation with disastrous humanitarian consequences. My country regrets this incident. Like the other incidents over recent months, this one helps to maintain a climate of mistrust between the Russian and Ukrainian parties and helps to undermine the peace efforts made by the international community to bring peace and stability in the region. Mr. President, my country would like to take this opportunity provided for by this meeting to urge the Russian and Ukrainian parties to demonstrate restraint in order to avoid a military escalation in the region. My delegation urges them to refrain from any actions that could lead to a new conflict that is larger in scale. My delegation deplores the lack of progress in implementing the Normandy format and Minsk agreements, and it urges the Russian and Ukrainian parties to promote a peaceful settlement to the difference that poses them. To this end, it expresses its support for the OSCE observer mission and for the Joint Center for Control and Coordination. We support their efforts to de-escalate the conflict. Furthermore, my delegation urges the Joint Center for Control and Coordination to play a supporting role for observers from the OSCE and to monitor the ceasefire agreements, in order to ensure the effective implementation of the Minsk agreements. So, in conclusion, I would like to reiterate Côte d'Ivoire's support for all efforts underway to find a negotiated political solution to the crisis in Ukraine. My country would urge all the protagonists to respect their commitments to ensure an effective implementation of the Minsk agreements and Resolution 2202 of the Security Council. Thank you very much.
Thank the representative of Côte d'Ivoire for the statement. Now give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
I thank the Chinese presidency for convening today's emergency meeting on the latest developments in the Azov Sea. Kazakhstan, as a member of the Council, is open to dialogue and is ready to debate over international security issues in transparent discussions for the cause of preventing international conflicts. Taking this into account, as well as the need to consider the matter within the framework of the Security Council, our delegation was ready to vote in favor of both requests, of Ukraine and of Russia. Kazakhstan considers both people of Ukraine and Russia as brotherly nations to our country, sharing common history throughout the past. In this regard, we urge both parties to refrain from steps leading to any further escalation of bilateral relations. It is of special importance for our state that Ukraine remains sovereign, stable, and independent. Kazakhstan is ready to assist to both nations, Russian Federation and Ukraine, to overcome crisis in their relations. Kazakhstan adheres to a balanced approach of solving the Ukrainian crisis through peaceful negotiations and a mediation process based on key principles and norms of international law and the United Nations Charter. My country has taken and continues to take part in multilateral consultations in seeking a settlement of this issue. We are determined to work closely with all members of the Council without political expediency and in an open, objective, responsible, and constructive way. It should be noted that in the past, our country made its contribution to the launch of the Normandy format and eventual conclusion of the Minsk agreements. Kazakhstan has as well repeatedly expressed its readiness to render its all-round assistance in the process, supporting a peaceful settlement in the southeast of Ukraine and fostering robust relations between Ukraine and Russia. In this way, our delegation is concerned that the negotiation process to resolve the Ukrainian conflict has actually been suspended during the past months. This is evidenced by the lack of contacts in the Normandy format at a higher level. Such suspension has a full potential for sparks of new negative developments in the region. To this end, it is with regret that we recognize the incident between the Russian Federation and Ukrainian Navy vessels in the Kerch Strait that took place yesterday on 25th of November. Kazakhstan urged both sides to act with utmost restraint to de-escalate the situation between two states. We consider this as the only viable existing mechanism in a peaceful way by restraining from any kind of negative actions. Such an incident can drastically raise the chances for an unintended spark to set the region on fire. Both governments must urgently step in and try to negotiate a deal to de-escalate the situation with possible assistance from the international community. We believe that sustainable peace and full-fledged normalization of relations between both countries can also be achieved through establishing CBMs in the security and economic dimensions as well. We should not allow further escalation of tensions, which could lead to active warfare in this new area. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan. Now give the floor to the representative of plurinational state of Bolivia.
Agradecemos la información.
Thank you, President. We're grateful to Ms. Di Carlo, U.S. Chief of Political Affairs, for her briefing, and we would like to express our concern about the events that unfolded yesterday in the Azov Sea. We reiterate that the military option cannot from any standpoint be viewed as a solution to any dispute. We therefore call on the parties to build the suitable conditions to avoid an escalation in tensions, to refrain from any action which could stoke violence, to uphold the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, and to respect international law and international maritime law, including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. To this end, we call upon the parties to work to find a peaceful solution through dialogue, bearing in mind the range of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements, so as to achieve a balance of interests without overlooking the principles of preventive diplomacy and good offices geared towards a negotiated political solution. We stress that both the international community and this Council must undertake all the necessary efforts to ensure the upholding of international peace and security. In the long term, this will be beneficial for the region, given that it is the parties themselves who must overcome their differences. Finally, we call on the leaders of both parties to overcome the divisions of the past, to prioritize peace for the benefit of their peoples, and we urge the international community to focus on the concerns of all parties with a neutral and equitable approach to achieve lasting stability. Thank you very much.
Okay. I thank the representative of Bolivia for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Peru.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. We're grateful for the convening of this meeting and the briefing given by Ms. Rosemary Di Carlo. Peru is deeply concerned by the recent incident in the Kerch Strait and its potential repercussions for the complex and unstable relations between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and for regional stability generally. We regret the recent escalation and greater tensions between the countries. In line with the UN Charter, Peru reiterates the need to respect the independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of Ukraine. We call on the parties represented here to act with restraint, to avoid any further escalation, and always to act pursuant to international law and the principle of the peaceful solution or settlement of disputes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Peru for his statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I'd like to express our appreciation to Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, and I would like to thank her for her briefing on developments in the Sea of Azov. The escalation of tensions that has recently happened in the Sea of Azov fills us with concern, and we call upon both sides to exercise self-restraint and to undertake all the necessary measures to diffuse tensions, especially military tensions in the Sea of Azov. We call upon both sides to abide by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We urge both sides to exhibit the necessary political will and to renew their commitment towards the full implementation of the Minsk Accords to resolve the conflict, and in order to maintain the peace and the security and stability of the region. We would like to renew our commitment to respecting Ukraine's unity and sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We stress the need not to interfere in its internal affairs. We hope that the parties involved would implement Resolution 2202 of the year 2015, the Minsk peace agreements, the presidential statement that was issued on the 6th of June 2018 fully. We hope that both sides would seek to arrive at a comprehensive and balanced solution to this issue through dialogue, as has been stipulated by Article 33 of the United Nations Charter. We stress the need to do so within the Normandy format and the trilateral contact group in order to achieve immediate progress towards the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for his statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Equatorial Guinea.
Thank you very much, President. At the outset, allow me to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, USG for Political Affairs, for her report and briefing about the latest developments on the situation in the Kerch Strait. President, on the 30th of October, and in various other prior occasions, Equatorial Guinea has called on the parties to respect the full implementation of the Minsk agreements, to refrain from any action which might aggravate and destabilize the situation in the country and in the wider region. That is why my delegation regrets the recent events that unfolded in the Azov Sea, and we are greatly concerned about the escalation in the situation which has led to the convening of this meeting. President, the situation in the Azov Sea raises new threats for stability in the region. Therefore, easing tensions to avoid an escalation in the situation is of the utmost priority at this time, and this requires the cooperation and determination of both parties. In this regard, we call on the parties concerned to keep calm and to refrain from taking any measure which might provoke a further escalation in the situation. We call on them to resolve the situation through political and diplomatic dialogue to achieve a peaceful and political solution to the crisis. President, given the complexity and the fragility of the situation, we believe that the efforts of the parties must be harmonized. We believe that only coordinated and harmonized efforts of the parties concerned will guarantee a fair, definitive solution to the situation. In this regard, my delegation urges the parties to find a political solution through dialogue and negotiations based on respect for international law, the principles of international relations, and the maintenance of regional stability, security, and peace. We stress the need for the parties to respect the United Nations Charter and to resolve their disputes in line with the existing multilateral and bilateral agreements. In conclusion, President, we would like once again to remind the parties that the only solution to the issue can be achieved through peaceful means, through direct, frank and inclusive negotiations. We therefore call on the parties to act with the utmost restraint to de-escalate the situation, to step up their efforts, and to commit not to act in any way that may heighten tensions further. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Equatorial Guinea for his statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me first of all thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. Mr. President, we have followed the situation around the Azov Sea. We are concerned by the rapid escalation of the situation in the area. It is vital that all efforts are made to reduce tension. We support the call by the OSCE today for the parties to exercise maximum restraint and refrain from taking actions that would further undermine the security and stability of the area. We also agree the need for the parties to address differences through political and diplomatic means. On the issue of Ukraine, we once again reiterate our support to the implementation of the Minsk Agreement for the peaceful settlement of the crisis. We believe it is absolutely imperative that the parties remain fully committed to the implementation of the Minsk Agreement and strictly adhere to Resolution 2202, which endorsed the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk Agreement. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for her statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me start by thanking USG DiCarlo for her update on the situation in and around the Sea of Azov. And at the outset, I'd like to support the procedural point that was put forward by the United Kingdom and Poland. And in line with Resolution 68/262 adopted by the General Assembly with an overwhelming majority on the 27th of March 2014, let me reiterate our full support for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Less than a month ago, we sat in this chamber to discuss the situation in Ukraine. And it is clear that the volatile security situation in this part of the world needs to be addressed urgently. Mr. President, I will focus on 3 issues today: the events of Sunday, November 25th, the context in which these events are taking place, and thirdly, steps towards de-escalation. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is deeply concerned about yesterday's developments in the Black Sea region. The blocking of the Kerch Strait by the Russian Federation, denying access to Ukrainian ports, constitutes a violation of international law. This is not acceptable. As stated in the open briefing of October 30th, the security situation in this area has direct consequences for the wider Black Sea region. Mr. President, that brings me to my second point. Let us focus on the root cause of the situation we are discussing today: the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by the Russian Federation. This remains a violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The annexation constitutes an ongoing threat to international peace and security that merits the full attention of this Council. Since 2014, the security situation in the region has been worsening due to the actions taken by the Russian Federation. It has militarized the Crimean Peninsula, illegally built a bridge over the Kerch Strait, and has imposed unilateral and unwarranted limitations on maritime shipping in the Sea of Azov. Mr. President, thirdly, any further escalation of tensions must be prevented, and we call on the Russian Federation to hold all restrictions on the freedom of navigation it has imposed in and to the Sea of Azov, and refrain from any further military confrontations with Ukrainian vessels in the region. Such actions are illegal and violate Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We furthermore reiterate the various calls from the international community, including from the European Union, on all parties involved to show the utmost restraint in order to prevent any further escalation of tensions. The stakes are high and consequences could be grave. As said in the briefing on October 30th, the Kingdom of the Netherlands welcomes Ukraine's decision to seek arbitration under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And we urge the Russian Federation and Ukraine to commit to this arbitration process and seek a peaceful legal settlement of this dispute. Mr. President, let me end by reiterating that sustainable peace and stability in the region will only be possible if and when the Russian Federation returns to respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Netherlands for her statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. First of all, I wish to thank USG DiCarlo for her statement, for her briefing. China has noted the altercation between Russian and Ukrainian naval ships in the waters near the Kerch Strait. We are concerned with the tension arising thereof. China hopes and calls for the relevant parties to exercise restraint to avoid any further escalation of tension and properly resolve the relevant issues through dialogue and consultations. China has all along maintained its objectivity and impartiality on the Ukrainian crisis. China respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine, and opposes any external forces interfering in Ukraine's internal affairs. We are always of the view that military solution will get nowhere. Dialogues and negotiations are the only way to resolve crisis. The international community must stay the course of diplomatic efforts to push for a political settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. The discussion of the Security Council should be conducive to genuine ease of tension in the affected areas of Ukraine to play a constructive role in facilitating a political solution. China is of the view that all the relevant parties should earnestly implement the new Minsk Agreement, stay the course of political settlement through dialogue and consultation to seek a comprehensive solution to the Ukrainian issue, so that Ukraine can achieve peace, stability, and development, whereby all ethnic communities can live in peace and Ukraine can live in peace with all the countries in the region. China stands ready to continue its positive role in the political settlement of the crisis. I now resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, before coming here, I did what some of us normally do every morning. I searched through internet to find out what happened this day in history. And look what I found. Exactly on this day, November 26, in 1939, the Soviet army orchestrated an incident by shelling a village of Maynila near the Soviet-Finnish border. Then the Soviets claimed the shelling was done by the Finnish side and used it as a pretext for the invasion on November the 30th. That's how the so-called Winter War started, which eventually led to the expulsion of the Soviet Union from the League of Nations. Interesting, isn't it? That is so to say about the unlearned lessons. Это господин Полянский к вопросу.
Mr. Polyansky was talking about who was learning lessons and who was not learning lessons.
I appreciate the convening of this briefing at the request of Ukraine. I would like to sincerely thank the members of the Security Council for their unwavering support of my country, demonstrated once again today. And of course, thank you, USG DiCarlo, for your very useful update. We are convinced that it is of utmost importance to discuss the recent developments near the Kerch Strait, since they constitute a clear threat to international peace and security. Before delivering on the subject, I would like first to express my dismay at the attempt of the Russian Federation to manipulate the agenda of the Security Council and to have a meeting convened under a deceiving title, Violation of the Borders of the Russian Federation. In this regard, I have to emphasize that according to the international law, Crimea and respective territorial waters are the Ukrainian territory, temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation. Hence, there are no Russian borders in the area where the incident happened. I repeat, there are no state Russian borders around the Crimean Peninsula. Dear colleagues, you have already heard the Russian interpretation of the events, which, as usual, is concocted to mix reality with fiction with an ultimate goal of misinforming, misleading, and confusing the listener. Instead of real details of yesterday's incident, we heard epic stories about apocalypse in Ukraine. The Russian claims about violation of the Russian border by the Ukrainian naval ships is an outright lie, invested just to cynically shift all the responsibility on the Ukrainian side, consciously manipulating the facts and ignoring the evidence. Mr. President, for the better understanding of the situation by all Council members, I would like to present the main facts of what happened during the last 3 days. First of all, in accordance with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and Article 2 of the Treaty between Ukraine and the Russian Federation on cooperation in the use of the Azov Sea and the Kerch Strait, Ukrainian Navy enjoys full freedom of navigation in the Kerch Strait and the Sea of Azov, and therefore can pass through the Kerch Strait at any time. On 23rd November, the Ukrainian Navy boat group, small armored boats Nikopol and Berdyansk, and a tugboat Yani Kapu started a planned transfer from the port of Odessa in the Black Sea to the port of Mariupol in the Azov Sea. The route and procedure of this passage were the same as in September this year, when 2 Ukrainian naval vessels, Donetsk and Korets, sailed from Odessa to Mariupol. On 24th November, during the naval march, the commander of the Ukrainian naval group received a notice from the Russian authorities concerning the closure of navigation in the Kerch Strait area. However, the International Center for Navigation Control, located in Spain, did not confirm this notification. On 25th November, the Ukrainian commander requested twice the Russian Maritime Control Services the passage through Kerch Strait. He did not receive any answer. Later, the Russian Maritime Control Officer directed the Ukrainian Navy boat group to the so-called area of waiting. It was stated that Ukrainian vessels would be soon informed on the Kerch Strait passage procedure. And then all hell broke loose. Approximately at 8:39 a.m., a Russian Coast Guard ship made a ram attack against a tugboat Yani Kapu and damaged it. The video of this attack is available online. If you watch it, you will clearly see that the Ukrainian boat was trying to avoid the collision, while the Russian ship was deliberately carrying out the attack. I also have to warn you that if you happen to understand the Russian language, you will hear lots of profanities from the Russian sailors in that short video clip. After the ramming, the Russian vessels blocked the other 2 Ukrainian vessels from rendering assistance to a damaged vessel. All this time, the Russian vessels were trying to provoke Ukrainian seamen to open fire. At 1:22 p.m., 2 Russian K-52 Alligator attack helicopters approached the Ukrainian cutters at their anchorage spot at the height of 50 meters. They openly demonstrated their missile armaments and the laser aiming device. After completing the dangerous maneuvering, the helicopters departed towards the Crimean Peninsula. From 1:40 p.m., Russia has physically blocked the passage beneath the so-called Kerch Bridge, having located there a tanker and later a cargo ship. After 7 p.m., due to the impossibility to pass the strait, the Ukrainian Navy ships headed back to exit the Kerch Strait. I repeat, they headed back, away from the strait and towards the open sea. They were immediately followed by a group of about 10 Coast Guard and Russian Black Sea Fleet vessels. There are audio recordings of communications among the Russian vessel commanders regarding the orders on how to proceed. These recordings clearly demonstrate that the Russian military vessels were given orders to attack the Ukrainian vessels after the latter started to withdraw from the area. Approximately at 8:30 p.m., the Russian side carried out the shoot-to-kill order. I have all these recordings even in my telephone, but I will not waste your time, of course. I will just quote a couple of exchanges which were intercepted. There is a conversation between the base in Kerch and the Russian boat called Izumrud. Hands up, everyone on board, hands up. Surround your arms, we will shoot to kill. And then finally, well, who was carrying the shooting? It's from Izumrud. I cannot connect with Izumrud, there is a commotion in the air. They are shouting, the Ukrainians are sinking, and what is going on with them, I don't understand. And then the commander from Kerch is asking, who gave the order to shoot to kill? And the captain of Izumrud replies, it was me, according to your previous orders. So the vessels, the Ukrainian vessels Berdyansk and Nikopol were damaged. After the Ukrainian vessels were forced to stop and they were seized by the Russian FSB special forces. 6 Ukrainian seamen are wounded, 3 of them seriously, and according to the previous information, 1 is in a critical situation. So once again, the video footage of ramming and shooting, as well as relevant audio recordings, have been already posted online, and everybody can consult them to see what happened and how it happened. Distinguished members of the Council, throughout all these events, the Ukrainian side acted strictly in line with the international law and the existing bilateral agreement with the Russian Federation. Ukraine's right to cross the Kerch-Yenikal Canal is guaranteed by paragraph 1 of Article 2 of the treaty between Ukraine and Russia on cooperation and use of the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait from 2003. The treaty clearly provides for the freedom of navigation for both civil and military vessels of Ukraine and Russia in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. Now, this is the treaty that was signed by the current Russian government.
Mr. Polyansky, you're not going to deny that this agreement has been signed by your side and needs to be upheld.
Secondly, the Russian Federation was duly and well in advance informed through traditional channels of communication about passing of the Ukrainian Navy's group through the Kerch Strait. Thirdly, the Ukrainian Navy group strictly followed the orders of the Traffic Control Service. As you can see, there were no provocations whatsoever from Ukraine's part. Nevertheless, the Russian Federation opted to purposefully block the passage of the Ukrainian ships, thus violating the freedom of navigation guaranteed by the Ukraine-Russia Cooperation Agreement in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. Moreover, Russia committed an act of an open military aggression against Ukraine by targeting, firing on, and capturing 3 military vessels. I would like to remind everyone that Article 3 of the General Assembly Resolution 3314 qualifies as an act of aggression, and I quote, an attack by the armed forces of a state on the land, sea, or air forces, or marine and air fleets of another state, End of quote. Russia's recent belligerent acts constitute yet another violation of international law, including the UN Charter, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, as well as existing bilateral agreements. This is a conscious provocation aimed at aggravation of the security situation in the region with the aim to establish its full control over the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. There is an irrefutable evidence that the recent Russian aggressive actions were planned and authorized by the top Russian military leadership. Mr. President, the restrained reaction of Ukraine clearly demonstrates that we are committed to solve the current situation by peaceful means and in full compliance with international law and existing bilateral obligations. Nevertheless, further escalation of the situation by the Russian Federation should not be ruled out. According to available intelligence data, there is a clear threat for invasion and seizing of Mariupol and Berdyansk. Further aggressive acts and provocations by the FSB Border Guard Service and Russian Navy remains a realistic possibility. Due to these threats, yesterday the President of Ukraine supported the initiative of the National Security and Defense Council to propose to the Parliament of Ukraine to declare the martial law for 60 days, but cut it short to 30 to avoid unnecessary speculations. This martial law can be lifted any time. It has no negative effect on respect for human rights and functioning of democratic institutions. In response to the Russian delegation's scare stories about alleged motives of Ukraine's president regarding the martial law, I will just quote the president's statement available online, the statement he made just a couple of minutes ago. The martial law will last 30 days and will be over in the middle of December. In early December, I will submit a draft decision of the Parliament regarding the date of the presidential elections, which, according to the Constitution, are to be held on 31st March 2019. Full stop. Ukraine is ready to settle the situation through political and diplomatic means. At the same time, we are ready to use all available means in exercising our right to self-defense, as foreseen by Article 51 of the UN Charter. Mr. President, the Kremlin's criminal regime has once again demonstrated that it won't stop its aggressive policy and is ready for any acts of aggression against the Ukrainian state. The dramatic escalation of the situation in the region needs a prompt reaction from international community. These events are yet another testament to the relevance of the United Nations General Assembly draft resolution prepared by Ukraine and the group of like-minded states regarding the issue of militarization of Crimea and the Black and Azov Seas. Once again, we are grateful for today's strong statements in support of Ukraine, with the call upon the Russian Federation to guarantee the freedom of navigation in the region while condemning the Russian acts of aggression in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Ukraine demands Russia to immediately release 23 captured Ukrainian soldiers and all 3 Ukrainian ships. We also call on the international community to implement a new set of sanctions aimed at addressing the situation in the region, including against Russia's Azov ports. The increased political pressure on Moscow would contribute to the de-escalation of the security situation on the sea and unblocking the free crossing of the Kerch-Yenikal Canal. If unopposed, Kremlin regime will take another and another aggressive act, creating even wider conflict in the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've heard a lot of very interesting things today, and I would just like to share our views of what has been said. Although, of course, much of it does not warrant being talked about. Much has been very predictable. First and foremost, I'd like to say that once again, we have been justified in our proposal to hold a meeting under another item agenda was absolutely right, because today, people have been talking about whatever they wanted, annex, occupation, aggression, and once again, apparently we also have annexed and occupied the Sea of Azov. That's something new to us. We didn't know about that. But the main topic here is something that not many people have talked about, in fact, apart from Vladimir Yurich, who predictably talked about some incidents that I'll come back to. So why did the Ukrainians feel that they were able to use that area, but they moved to an act of provocation and subjected their own sailors to a risk of their life? And nobody's managed to answer that question. Nobody even referred to that. So that could be perceived as being carte blanche for Ukraine to carry out acts of aggression and to pose a threat to the entire region. And given what the Ukrainian representative said, that is exactly what Ukraine thinks. I'd just like to correct what some speakers said. What was said by Ms. De Carlo, it was a bit odd. She seemed to mix up Crimea and the Minsk agreements. And I do hope, Madam, that you have read the Minsk agreements. I'm sure you're well aware that no mention whatsoever is made there of Crimea. You also urged the sovereignty to be respected. Surely the sovereignty of the Russian Federation should be expected too. At least that is our understanding of what you believe. Ms. Haley also touched upon the fact that Crimea is part of the Minsk agreements too. And Ms. Haley, perhaps it seems that you're saying now that the Sea of Azov is part of the Minsk agreements too. Perhaps I just misheard. But unfortunately, that is really astounding. In a previous meeting, Mr. Nebenzia, our permanent representative, talked about he gave an entire analysis of the Minsk agreement. He went through it really paragraph by paragraph. And despite that, we have to hear these egregious things. Now, as regards the incident itself, well, there are many questions. Of course, the investigation is underway, and of course, we will share the outcome of that. But I don't want to predict what is still a hot topic. But I'd just like to highlight 2 points that have not yet been mentioned. But clearly, they pertain to this, and they need analysis. For example, one of the vessels, there were 2 staff members from the Ukrainian security services, and they had a mission to act in a certain way. And there's another small detail, but it's an important one. The Ukrainian party violated our border in a particular place that up until 2013 was part of Russian territory. If we're talking about crime and not talking about Crimea, rather, and not talking about Crimea. So they came up from the south. So this was a gross act of provocation. There's just no other qualification. But nonetheless, you are not prepared to recognize that as an act of provocation. Furthermore, it should be pointed out that your actions inter alia by supporting Ukraine's version of what happened is already leading to an exacerbation of the situation in the east of Ukraine, inter alia. As our OSCE colleagues have told us, the confrontation line of Istris, there have been shellings, etc. in that area. The Lugansk capital has had shelling, and military servicemen have been moved around to Petrovsk. And the Rasadka town has been captured as well. So these are specific events. They violate clearly the Minsk agreements, and all the rest, at least a lot of what has been said here today, has nothing to do with this. And you are just completely ignoring these facts. I'd also like to say that since Crimea has been touched upon, although Crimea is not on the Security Council's agenda, I'd like to underscore that the issue of who Crimea belongs to for us and for the Crimeans is not an open question anymore, whether you like it or not. No sanctions or no further restrictions will change our opinion. That issue was closed after the Crimeans voted in a free election and referendum to become part of Russia. That was a referendum on self-determination. Many people are asking, well, did they know what would face them, given the current geopolitical anti-Russian project in Ukraine? Of course, people had no illusions. They knew what would happen. Now, does Russia regret what has happened? No, in no way, shape, or form. Furthermore, I'd like to say that the majority of Russians are proud of what has happened because we have sought to protect Crimeans. If we had not done so, then they would be subject to what subjected to what the people in Donbass are currently being subjected to at the moment. And these are Russian-speaking people who protected the area from the fascists. There's also a need to mention, and I didn't mention this in my previous statement regarding the proper topic, that the decision taken by Ukraine has really given free rein to the nationalists in Ukraine. Nobody mentioned the fact today that there was another attack on the Russian embassy in Kiev. The Ukrainian authorities did nothing, and a car was set on fire earlier. The radicals are threatening to storm the permanent representation, and there's no reaction coming from you. That just seems to be normal, in your opinion, it would seem. We are urging that the Ukrainian party, the side, ensure that complete protection be given to the Russian permanent representation in line with consular relations, that agreement. Mr. President, since you represent China, I'd like to remind you of something that was said by Confucius, namely, it's very difficult to find a black cat in a dark room, in particular if the black cat is not in the room. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, this is precisely what you're doing. You are condemning a Russian act of aggression, but you're not actually talking about the reason for why we actually met today in this meeting. The problem is right in front of you, and it's very easy to solve it. You can just solve the problem over a 10-minute period. You need the team from Washington. But unfortunately, given what our Ukrainian colleague said in his statement, I can understand that they are intending to carry on in the way that they have been acting. That needs to. You've been talking about how fantastical what we've been doing are. That needs to stop. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that what Kyiv has been doing in coordination with the US and others to promote a conflict line against Russia is fraught with very dangerous consequences. We are going to curb any infringement of Russian sovereignty and territorial integrity, including the Sea of Azov and that area. We do hope that that is clear to everyone. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. And the representative of Ukraine asks for the further statement. Now I give him the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be very brief, because I think I was clear enough in my previous statement, and it needs no further explanations. I'll just say that starting from spring 2014, we hear a lot of Russian epic stories about, Crimea is ours, Krim nash, and ich tam нет in Russian, which means we're not there. That's about Donbass. And I think everyone, at least in this building, is fully fed up with all these stories. My short remark is just, specifically for Mr. Polanski's knowledge, that the Kerch Strait can be approached only from the south because the Azov Sea is located to the north of the Black Sea. And when you said that the Ukrainian ships were cynically, nachalno, moving to the north, trying to enter the Kerch Strait, what did you mean? I didn't understand. They were attacked by the Russian Navy while they were moving from the Kerch Canal to the south. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. I have no more speakers inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.